Welcome to this moment in history's embrace. Slowly close your eyes. Let your body sink into the soft mattress. In undoubt, gentle and steady. Tonight, we will not be reciting dates, nor will we need to remember any complicated names. This will be a quiet, flowing journey, carrying you back to a world thousands of years ago. From the moment a stranger opens his eyes, accompanying him through daylight and storm, until he closes his eyes once more in the moonlight. This is not a classroom, but a whisper to accompany you to sleep. Do not think, simply listen. If you are ready, let us begin. I was not born in a palace. It was a night of wind and snow. The gale howled from the banks of the Rhine. A runaway steed beating against the walls of our wooden house. Snow, dislodged from the roof, would occasionally fall, striking the windowsill with a dull thud. The firelight in the hearth flickered, making it seem as if the entire house was swaying. My mother, Bertrada, lay on a bed of coarse linen, her face pale and beaded with sweat. She bit down hard, her hands clenched, with no royal physicians or golden instruments beside her, only a few nuns, whispering their prayers. Echoing across the plains of Italy again, why with the last vestiges of that winter storm. She looked at me, unsaid softly to those around her. At the time of my birth, my father, Pepin, was merely the mayor of the palace of the Frankish kingdom, a man who held the real power, but not the title. He managed the kingdom's military and political affairs, while the king in name was but a fading shadow of the declining Merovingian dynasty. From my earliest memories, I knew I carried a destiny different from that of other boys. My mother never told me bedtime stories. She taught me to read maps, spoke of bloodlines, recited poetry, and made me memorize a Latin phrase, Nascitur imperator. Non fit, an emperor is born, not made. I didn't understand its true meaning then. I only felt that my mother's gaze could see into the future. Her eyes were not those of a woman, but of a diviner standing at a crossroads, awaiting fate. My childhood had no fairy tales, no toys. My world was composed of three parts: the military camp, and my mother's shadow. I stood among the soldiers, watching them drill, learning how to hold a sword, how to keep my balance in the mud, how to block the first blow with a shield. I knelt at the feet of monks, listening to recitations from the Bible and the annals of history, hearing tales of Noah's Ark, the trials of Moses, and a Savior who died in Jerusalem. On those cold nights, my mother would enter my room, carrying an oil lamp. She would sit by my bed, stroke my forehead, and say, "One day your name will be written in the scrolls of priests and etched onto the swords of soldiers. But before that, you must first learn patience. Why can't I play like the other children?" She would smile and pat my head. "Because you are not others. You are your father's son, the fulcrum on which the entire future of the Franks rests." And also like a curse, every time I looked out the window at the vast, snowy fields and forests, I felt as if I were being kept by something, unable to run, unable to escape. But I still longed to run, longed for freedom. I loved to sneak out of the camp on horseback in the early morning mist, riding north along the tributaries of the Rhine, deep into the woods to watch wild deer graze and hear water birds rustle in the reeds. In those unseen places, to forget the responsibility on my shoulders, if only for a moment. But every time I returned, my mother would be waiting at the door. She never scolded me, only looked at me and said quietly, "He who flees from destiny will eventually be devoured by it." I knew she was right. I could not run. I was not born to live a gentle life, but to lead, and to pass on a legacy. One night, I fell from my horse and injured my knee. The pain brought tears to my eyes. I lay on the cold grass, gazing at the star-filled sky, and for the first time, I questioned God. Why not someone else? There was no answer, but a meteor streaked across the northern sky, like a sharp sword cutting through the darkness. I knew it was destiny's echo. When I was 8, my father brought me to a council of nobles. Many generals and lords were seated in the great hall. He had me stand in their midst and said, "This is my son. You will all bear witness to his name." In that moment, I understood I was no longer a child in my mother's arms, nor an escapee in the forest. I had become a piece on the board, a wager on the future of an empire. Later, people would say I was destined to be an emperor. I do not deny it, but I know better than anyone that the word destined is built from countless moments of pain and sacrifice. It is not a halo granted by God, but a crown one forges for oneself. And so I set out upon this path, with no turning back, and no other choice. In the year 768, my father died, lying in his bed. His face was as pale as a stone carving. His lips were as silent, with only the intermittent sound of wind between his breaths. He grasped my hand, then turned to look at my younger brother, Charlemagne. In that moment, and an unfulfilled ambition, my father had spent his entire life doing one thing, transforming himself from a mayor of the palace into a legitimate king. He was the first Frank to shatter the puppet regime of the Merovage in Est, using military force, clerical alliances, and political maneuvering to turn the coronation from a sham into a reality. But he was never certain if this throne could be securely passed down. According to Frankish tradition, my father's kingdom was divided in two. I ruled the northern lands of Neustria and the inland territories. Charlemagne received Burgundy and Aquitaine to the south. We each became king, each with our own army, council, and clerical support. Only my mother still moved between the two courts, trying with her determined eyes to keep our father's legacy from fracturing. I had hoped we could rule together, brothers side by side, like in the old legends, wielding twin swords to protect a single kingdom. I wrote to him, sending an envoy with a silver forged dagger, its hilt inscribed with a single line, "May we guard our father's kingdom together," each to the other like an arm and a wing. He never replied. Months later, a secret dispatch from the border informed me that he had detained bishops traveling through his lands and, at a banquet of nobles, had mockingly called me the arrogant false king, unworthy of being called the Lord's chosen. Our border was quiet, yet filled with hostility. We would each dispatch our armies to the frontier for maneuvers ostensibly for practice, but, in reality, a test of strength. I stood on a hill, watching the banners of his army in the distance, a white standard with a blue eagle, snapping in the wind. I suddenly realized we were no longer brothers, potential assassins of each other's claim. But I did not want to fight. I knew this was not the power I craved, at least not power gained by my brother's fall. Then, 3 years later, news came that he had fallen ill. He was struck by a high fever, vomiting uncontrollably. The archbishop went to administer last rites, and I sent physicians with medicine. But it was all in vain. He died quickly and quietly. His attendants brought me a final letter, containing only a few words. "May God forgive us for our suspicions of each other." As I looked at the letter, his death was not what I had wished for. Yet it thrust the entire kingdom onto my shoulders alone. Those who had been loyal to him either pledged themselves to me, fled to Rome, or took their own lives. Almost overnight, the dual kingdom of the Franks became a single monarchy. People cheered, calling it the will of God, saying that Charles would lead the empire to unity. But I sat alone late at night, staring at the candlelight and whispering, "I did not kill you with my own hands, but your death." In the end, he would always lunge at me, gritting his teeth, while I would just laugh and dodge. He suddenly stopped, looked at me coldly. "You never fight, but you always win." I woke with a start, my forehead cold and down, the window showing nothing but the boundless night. My father's shadow had just faded, and I, the orphan pushed onto this throne, finally stood at the pinnacle of power, only to feel a vast emptiness around me, with no one by my side. From that moment, I began to understand the hardest thing for an emperor to protect is not his territory or his army, but the last flicker of softness left in his heart. I was 30 years old that year. My empire was beginning to take shape, and my solitude had officially arrived. They said the Saxons were barbarians, descendants of beasts, a pagan spawn of mud and rust. But when I first set foot on their land, What greeted me was not savagery, but a cold, silent faith so ancient it was ominous inspiring. I led my army across the Rhine. The mist not yet dispersed. The morning light filtered through the pine forests. Our scouts reported a Saxon holy site deep in a valley, a place they called the Irm in Sul, a massive sacred tree, said to connect heaven and earth, man and the gods. I ordered my troops to make camp and rode there alone. The sacred tree was even older than I had imagined, its branches gnarled like sinuous, its trunk carved with countless runes and totems. A white minus-haired priest was chanting beneath it. He showed no alarm, just watched me quietly, his eyes neither hostile nor pleading. I reined in my horse and asked him, "Do you not know this is a place that forsakes the true God?" He smiled faintly. "If you truly believed in your God, why would you fear our tree?" I was silent. The next day, I ordered the sacred tree to be burned. Flames rose in the forest, the oak crackling, the runes turning to ash. The old priest stood in the distance, saying nothing, as if he had already accepted this fiery fate. The wind carried the scent of resonant blood. My soldiers cheered. "The Lord is victorious." I saw the tears of old women and children. I knew this was not victory. This was only the beginning. From that moment, the war between myself and the Saxons lasted for 30 years. They surrendered every year and rebelled every year. Like the snow melt in their forests, scum on the surface, but a torrent underneath. Every spring, I led my army north. Every winter, I retreated to Aachen. When the snows melted, the war reignited. Like an endless dialogue between God and man, I once ordered massive wooden tubs to be set up on the battlefield, where thousands of captives stood in lines as priests sprinkled them with holy water. One by one, after the baptism, they were transformed from pagans into people of Christ. But I always felt their eyes were hollow. They did not resist, but not the light. I also resorted to the cruelest of measures. After a rebellion, 500 Saxon warriors to make an example of them. It was the bloodiest day in the history of my empire, and the river ran red with blood. I sat alone in my tent. The Bible lay on my table, the firelight dim. I asked the priest beside me, "Are we truly fighting for God? Or are we just using his name to conquer?" He was silent for a long time before saying, "The Lord's will, at times, must be carried out by the sword." But I knew that night, my heart sank like a stone. I had never doubted myself so profoundly. Years later, standing on the walls of the rebuilt Aachen town of Paderborn, looking at the new churches, the reformed markets, the baptized children, I still could not say who this land truly belonged to me, or to their gods. Their sacred springs had long since dried up, but whenever it rained, the old well springs would still seep water, like stubborn drops of memory, refusing to be evaporated by a new faith. I learned to no longer proclaim victory so loudly, because I understood that true conquest is never about land or taxes. It is about the soul, and the soul is the most difficult thing in the world to command. They said Rome was the eternal city, the heart of a glorious empire, the source of holiness and order. But when I first set foot on that soil, what greeted me was corruption, division, and an air of decay so thick you could breathe it. My horses have trod on streets of broken flagstones and mud. The once minus great Senate had long ago devolved into a battleground for aristocrats and clergy. Soldiers looked like beggars, their eyes full of suspicion. That evening, I walked into St. Peter's Basilica. This had once been the center of the Christian world, a witness to saints and emperors. But now, its massive bronze doors were rusted, and the candles on the altar were crooked, as if faith itself had grown tired. Pope Leo I was the soul within this sacred shell. He was a small, despite his magnificent robes, moved as lightly as a shadow. He received me with a humble smile. We spoke at length in his private study. He did not mince words. "Your Majesty, they mean to depose me," he said in a low voice. "They accuse me of adultery, of perjury, of plotting to kill my rivals. But they will not spare me. I did not respond immediately, only gazed out the window at the distant, crumbling Colosseum. I knew he was telling the truth, but I also knew he was a political animal. "So you have come to me, hoping I'll win back Rome for you?" He did not answer at once. Instead, he knelt and pressed them to his lips, trembling undevout as if kissing a holy relic. "I will name you God's sword and shield on earth, if only you will protect me. The church will be forever in your debt." I neither refused nor agreed. In that moment, I felt not pity, but calculation. This was an opportunity, a perfect chance to elevate me from king of the Franks to the true heir to the empire. And so, I agreed. I sent my troops into Rome, purged the nobility, sealed the streets. Many nobles vanished in the night, their boots found floating in the Tiber the next day. Leo II ascended the pulpit once more, announcing that the heretics have been cleansed. During that time, he followed me like a shadow, proclaiming my virtue and justice to every bishop, officer, and noble. My reputation began to travel from the north into Italy. Some of the old Roman families began to privately call me a second Caesar. But I felt no joy in this. And he was giving me legitimacy. We were using each other. One night, I was praying alone in St. Peter's Basilica. The candlelight illuminated the vast fresco of the Last Judgment on the ceiling. I looked at the dense crowd of angels and demons and suddenly felt a confusion rise within me. Whose side am I truly on? Footsteps sounded behind me. Leo, I approached. He stood beside me, his voice slow and clear. "Will you be the sword of God?" I did not answer, because I knew that a sword never belongs to God. In that moment, our pact was sealed. We both understood that we were no longer just a king and opponent. We were co-minus conspirators, playwrights on the stage of history, and he had already prepared the stage for my coronation, waiting only for a sufficiently grand Christmas, and a declaration to push me onto the high pedestal of eternal emperor. But as it turned out, I had vastly underestimated the strategy hidden within his trembling hands. I was not a man born to fear God. I believed in steel and fire. I believed in a knight's oath, the rhythm of a battle standard, the smoke rising from a border signal. My faith was not on the high altar of a cathedral, but the higher I stood, the wider my empire grew. The more I was forced to ask myself, for whom do I fight? For what do I slaughter? War taught me cruelty, but it did not teach me righteousness. I had seen with my own eyes a bishop bless soldiers before a march, sprinkling holy water, offering the host, praying for the Lord's protection. But the next day, those same soldiers were pierced by arrows, consumed by flames, their heads cut off by the enemy and hung on the city walls. I had also seen a young pagan Saxon girl, standing before the executioner's block, close her eyes and pray, whispering the name of her God. She did not weep or tremble, only possessed a strange serenity, a serenity more steadfast than any Christian I had ever seen. Looking at her, I felt a flicker of... I once thought that by eradicating pagans, promoting baptism, building churches, and funding monasteries, I could become the Lord's faithful servant. But I grew to doubt whether the Lord needed a servant like me. That winter, I took shelter in a monastery on the Rhine, and the wind drove snow against the window panes like the size of a god. I sat on a stone bench, wrapped in a thick cloak, an open gospel before me. I stared at the dense Latin script, as if looking at a letter from another world. I could read the words, but I could not read the mind of God. The door opened, and Alcuin entered. He was a scholar I had invited from England, a quiet, firm, gentle yet sharp thinker. He sat across from me, glanced at the scroll in my hands, and asked softly, "Your Majesty, what are you searching for?" "An answer," I replied, "about whether we are worthy of God's blessing." He was silent for a moment, then asked in return, "Do you believe God's blessing is earned with war horses and spears?" I said nothing, opened it to a page, and pointed to a line he had written. "A true kingdom is not built on walls and blades, but on the order and reverence within the heart." I sighed. But this world is so vast, so chaotic, with so many who do not believe. "Ben, let us begin," he said, by teaching them to read. That night, for the first time, I tried to hold a quill pen and write my name careless. The strokes were shaky. The ink bled, like the scroll of a child. Alcuin did not laugh, but only nodded gently. "I have conquered countless cities," I said, "yet I cannot conquer a single page." "And that," he replied, "is why you are worthy of the title Father of the Empire." From that day on, I issued a decree to establish a palace school, to have the sons of nobles learn Latin, arithmetic, rhetoric, and logic. I ordered monks to copy ancient texts, to collect knowledge, regardless of whether it came from a Christian source. Beside every fortress, there must be a library. Before he holds a sword, must be able to recite a prayer. I began to transform faith from a command of the blade into a habit of the mind. But I knew this was a long conquest, even more difficult than unifying Saxony. An empire can be built by force, but a civilization can only be sustained by conviction. No longer just a king of war, would also have to become a shepherd of souls. I sat at my desk, looking at the holy icon in the candlelight, and suddenly understood. A blade can cut down a demon, but it can also sever faith. Only wisdom can leave an inextinguible light in the midst of chaos. The year 800. Christmas Day. Rome. That morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sky was not yet light, but the church bells of the city were already tolling through the thin mist. The wind swept across the street, brushing past the columns and banners. It lifted the hem of my cape and stirred a touch of unease I hadn't noticed was in my heart. I did not wear armor, but a ceremonial robe of ivory white. The Pope had it specially made for me, embroidered with golden crosses and grapevine patterns. I looked at my reflection in a bronze mirror and saw a different person, no longer the barbarian king who warred in the north, but an image about to step into the realm of the sacred. The candles in the basilica were already lit. Incense spiraled through the air, mixing with the scent of burning wood, like a cloud of mist leading to heaven. The hall was filled with nobles, bishops, monks, all in their finest attire, standing in solemn silence. A hymn slowly rose, the pipe organ murmuring like the voice of God. The moment I stepped into St. Peter's Basilica, the entire space seemed to freeze. My footsteps echoed on the stone floor 1, 3, as if with every step a part of my past self died, and my future self was slowly being born. I had assumed this was just a symbolic ceremony, a political performance, minus starring the Pope and myself. He would preserve his spiritual authority, and I would gain the symbol of empire. We had not discussed the details beforehand. I believed I was still in control. But as I knelt before the altar, the unexpected happened. Pope Leo I did not bless me as he usually would. Instead, he abruptly raised a crown I had never truly seen before, studded with jewels, reflecting the firelight from the altar. He said, "In the name of St. Peter, Charles, Emperor of the Great Franks and the Romans." He placed the crown firmly on my head. The movement was swift, solemn, yet full of control. The hymn changed its tune. Nobles fell to their knees, and a great cry went up, "Long live the Emperor! Long live! Long live!" And I only felt a chill run down my neck. He had not asked for my consent. He had not waited for me to rise. In a surprise attack of ceremony, he had placed the explosive charge of Emperor on my head, and I had no choice but to accept it in public. I slowly stood, looking at him. His expression was as serene as ever, as if he had just completed a holy sacrament. 1,000 armies were clashing. In that moment, I had become an emperor, but not in my own name. I knew that from this day forward, but the successor to Rome, the master of the empire. But I also understood that I had become the core of a giant monster, a monster called empire. Larger than me, more complex than me, and far more difficult to control. After the coronation, I rode alone around the holy city as night fell. The lights of Rome twinkled like stars scattered across the earth. I took the crown from my head and held it in my hand. The heavy metal made my wrist ache. I asked myself, in a low voice, This crown, did I win it, or was it placed upon me by design? Power is never a pure gift. It is poisoned wine, a chain, a burning law. I accepted it not for the glory, but because I had no other choice, because I knew that if I did not wear it, it would eventually fall into other hands, or be destroyed in chaos and division. I am Charles the Great, but I am also but a stone, lifted from the deep well of fate. I had drawn borders with my sword, driven out pagans with my spear, and brought order to every inch of my empire with my army. But I paused before a simple quill pen. That pen was placed before me by Alcuin. He said, "To govern an empire, you do not rely on fear, but on order, and the seeds of order are hidden in the pages of books." I looked at the pen in silence, as if it were an unsheathed dagger light, yet not to be underestimated. Alcuin, that scholar from England, was thin, dressed in black robes, and walked almost without a sound. He was one of the few people I would silence myself to listen to. He was not like an officer, nor a bishop. He did not preach loudly or drone on. He would simply sit across from me at the long table on some evening, light an oil lamp, and say, "If you want your empire to not shatter into pieces after you die, you must teach them to read, to write, and to think." Curving Latin letters entwined like vines. I could not write Latin. My soldiers could not. My nobles could not. For all its strength, was like a giant with no memory. And so I nodded. I ordered a palace school to be built in Aachen, with Alcuin as its head. I decreed that the sons of nobles, the heirs of bishops, even the sons of generals must learn to read, must study theology, rhetoric, and logic. My scholars copied manuscripts day and night, transcribing and annotating the remnants of ancient Rome and Greece. The parchment gleamed with a greasy luster in the candlelight, the ink spreading like light seeping through the cracks of time. I learned. I, an emperor with calloused hands who had spent half a lifetime at war, now followed Alcuin at night, learning to form each stroke of Karolus with a quill. My writing was ugly, stiff. Once, I threw the pen on the floor in frustration and said, "This is harder than conquering Saxony." Alcuin smiled. "That is why it is worthwhile." I began to understand what he meant. An empire cannot be held together by iron and fire alone. It needs a skeleton, but it also needs a bloodstream, and writing is the bloodstream of civilization. We standardized weights and measures, creating a more legible Carolingian minuscule. I had rules set for copying, how pages should be laid out, how much margin to leave, how tall and wide the letters should be. Without these standards, books were just a chaotic jumble of symbols, not vessels for thought. I once walked into the scriptorium at Aachen and saw a dozen monks hunched over their desks, the sound of their quills a soft scratching. They did not speak. The lamplight illuminated the tops of their heads and their eyelashes. Every drop of ink seemed to be engraving the future. I turned to Alcuin and said, "This is our true army." He nodded. "Yes, these words will outlive any sword." I began to fund monastery libraries, sending envoys to distant Spain, Ireland, and Italy, just to find a single ancient scroll. I hunted for wisdom lost in the ashes as a hunter stalks his prey. Some said I had changed, that I was no longer acting like an emperor, but I knew I had simply gone from being a ruler to being a planter of trees. In Aachen, I planted an invisible tree. Its roots sunk deep into the soil of Latin, its branches spreading to every monastery, every scriptorium, every cathedral. I was not sure if it would blossom after I died, but I knew I had to keep watch over it. That winter, I walked into the palace school again and saw a group of children gathered around Alcuin, reciting poetry. It was snowing heavily outside, but the room was as warm as spring. I stood at the door, not entering, just listening quietly. The voice of one child was clear and bright. A true empire is a light kindled in the soul. In that moment, I understood. What I was leaving behind was not just territory, but people who, in the future, could read, think, and express themselves. I am Charlemagne, and also the sower of seeds. I had many sons, perhaps too many. As an emperor, my offspring were the hope for the empire's continuation. Their existence was sometimes a sword, sometimes a cup of poison. My eldest son was warlike like me, brave but impatient. Charlemagne was naturally intelligent but gloomy and suspicious. Louis, the one with the quiet gaze, who preferred to read alone, who seemed not to belong on a battlefield, was the one I once trusted most, and also worried about most. I once believed they would support each other as brothers, jointly guarding the empire I had built with my life. At a court council, I first tasted the bitter conflict between my role as a father and as an emperor. That year, I tried to adjust the fiefdoms on the border, only to be met with a joint protest from Charlemagne and his allied nobles. They no longer called me father, but your majesty. It was not a show of respect, but a drawing of the line. At a feast, Charlemagne even said, half-minus jokingly, "Our father loves the empire more than he loves us." I looked at him and said only one thing: if the empire is destroyed, your names will not even be left on a tombstone. They didn't believe me. They were too young and too ambitious. I began to understand that blood ties cannot tame desire, and kinship cannot withstand the temptations of power. I tried to legislate a clear order of succession, to define responsibilities and boundaries, but the day the decrees were issued, dissent followed. Nobles began to arrange secret marriages. Prophecies of a divided kingdom spread from the monasteries, and border commanders shifted their troops with alarming frequency. I grew more and more tired, and Louis, my youngest son, the one I had hoped would be the one, also changed in this game. He no longer came to hear my stories every day, no longer asked Aachen for lessons in calligraphy. He began to meet frequently with the archibalds, and to demand more independent authority. One night, I was walking in a long gallery in Aachen and saw him standing by a window, gazing at a distant tower. I walked over, intending to clap him on the shoulder, as I always had, but he did not turn, only said flatly, "Father, am I nothing more than a pawn on your chessboard?" My hand stopped in mid-minus air. I was silent for a long time, then answered, "But you are always maneuvering. You have never truly seen us as your children." In that moment, a dull needle pierced my heart. I had thought that by giving them honor, land, and wealth, I could win their loyalty. But I had forgotten that they were, first and foremost, human beings, my children, and humans feel jealousy and uncertainty, that I had never given them space to breathe. I thought of my own youth, how I had divided the kingdom with my brother Charlemagne after our father's death, how I had felt both relief when news of his death arrived. Was I now replaying my father's fate? I sat on my throne and watched each of my sons, staring at my shadow like hunters circling their prey, not at me. I began to believe that an empire can be inherited, but an emperor cannot. What I had built was not a network of kinship, but a vast machine. It ran well, but it was cold, and every gear ground away at blood ties and affection, until only the words right of succession remained. I made the most difficult decision to leave the entire empire after my death, to be the sole emperor. After Charles and Charlemagne died, the situation seemed stable, but the undercurrents were strong. I once dreamed I was on my deathbed, hearing the arguments of my 3 sons. They fought over the crown like jackals over a carcass, and my name was like an old robe. I woke with a start, my hand gripping the sword I had worn in my youth, as cold as ever. I knew my sons were not me. They were not Charlemagne, and I could not force them to be. In my later years, I was no longer the Charlemagne who charged into battle on horseback. My knees often ached so badly I could hardly stand. My back was as stiff as an old oak. When the bell for morning prayer rang, I had to be helped to my feet by attendants to walk down the long, gold minus red carpeted hall, as if traversing a world that was growing more distant by the day. I no longer held a sword, no longer wore armor. I was even reluctant to leave the city to inspect my lands in winter. And I, its lonely watchman. The empire was still vast, still running in an orderly fashion. Taxes arrived on time, Bishops reported the number of new baptisms. Monks across the lands continued to copy ancient scrolls, and the palace echoed with music and prayer. But I knew it was not my hand pushing it all forward. It was inertia. I increasingly felt that an empire was not a machine ruled by one man, but a habit, a tired echo. I often sat alone in a small hall in the garden behind the throne. My favorite place. There were no courtiers, no reports, only a few holly trees and a stone bench. The winter sun would fall through the grey minus white clouds, dusting the frosted leaves like flecks of gold peeling from an old painting. It was there that I wrote my own epitaph, but simply to leave a marker for those who would come after. I, Charles, King of the Franks, Emperor of the Romans, servant of the Lord. I did not write the great, because I knew those words would eventually be scattered by the wind. I began to organize all my laws, edicts, and documents. I summoned Alcuin and his disciples and had them archive decades of decrees, categorize them by subject, and rewrite them in precise Latin. I told them, after I die, the empire may change, but the law must not fall into chaos. Even if you forget my name, you must not forget the law. They promised me they would, but I knew that people, in the end, choose to forget. I also began to renovate the cathedral at Aachen. I wanted it to be a testament to my entire life, its exterior like a Roman temple, its structure inspired by the octagonal chapel at Ravenna, its walls inlaid with Byzantine Minor-style mosaics. I ordered the empire's finest metals, holy relics, and manuscripts to be brought and embedded in its pillars and altar. But to unify, I wanted to gather all the fragments of civilization here, to fall a beacon of unity behind me. I would sit beneath the central dome, listening to the monks chanting, my eyes closed, hearing the tolling of the bells. I suddenly realized I had conquered everything, except time. I dreamed I was a boy again, the child illuminated by firelight in my mother's arms. She stroked my head and said, "Charles, you will be a king, but you must learn to walk the night road alone." I woke with a start. The room was silent, save for the soft crackle of wood in the stove. The empire was vast, but I was growing more and more alone. I stopped seeing so many envoys, stopped handling so many affairs. I slowly transferred power to Louis, even though I knew he was not yet ready. But I also knew I had no more time to wait. Late at night, I would walk alone to the underground chapel of the Aachen Cathedral, where my tomb was already prepared, a stone throne in the center, a chair carved with my name, symbolizing my eternal reign. I would sit on it, close my eyes, and feel its cold, hard touch, as if fate were carving me, inch by inch. I never feared death. What I feared was that everything I had built would melt away like snow in the sun. In the year 814, on a January morning, it snowed in Aachen. I sat by the window, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, a fox-minus fur blanket over my knees. The stove burned brightly. The room was warm as early spring, but I felt a persistent chill. It was not cold, but a kind of pulling away from deep within my body, like a warrior on the battlefield. The moment the final arrow pierces his chest, he knows death is upon him, but no longer resists. Writing was too strenuous. Speaking came in short bursts, and even my memory had begun to fray. I often called people by the wrong names, mistaking a general for a monk, today for yesterday. My attendants tried to mask their anxiety with smiles, but I would just smile back. It doesn't matter, I told them. The empire doesn't need me to remember everything. It will carry on by itself. I had already handed most of my power to Louis. When he stood by my bedside, I would study his face. But I saw that he was not men did he need to be. He would rule this land in his own way. I was merely the one who lit the first fire. On the 20-8th of January, I fell asleep at dusk. There was no great pain, no struggle, only the snowflakes drifting down outside the window, landing silently on the sill like a sigh from fate. I heard a bell, perhaps the evening prayer from the cathedral, or perhaps just my own heartbeat. The world went dark. They say I passed away in prayer. My hands clasped. I do not know if that was an embellishment. But it does not matter. Death needs no decoration. It is an emperor's final coronation. According to my will, I was buried in the Aachen Cathedral, not lying down. They dressed me in my ceremonial robes, placed the crown on my head, and put the scepter in my hand. Beneath my feet was a footstool inscribed with words from the Bible. Behind me was the marble throne. It was not a funeral, but a ritual. My subjects, my monks, my heirs filed into the cathedral, looking up at the body that was like a god, like a statue. They said I was still on my throne. Year after year, countless people came to pay homage. Some said I was not dead, only sleeping. Some said I had turned to stone to guard the soul of the empire. Others claimed to have heard me whispering behind the altar at night, recounting the wars and glories of the past. I was no longer Charlemagne. I had become Charles the Great. I was no longer a man, but a concept, a symbol of power, a name written into holy books, into chronicles, onto stone tablets, and into dreams. I know that one day, men will again divide the empire I unified. They will alter my laws. They will use my name to forge new dynasties. Because I once lit the fire of civilization. I once tamed savagery with thought, tempered slaughter with faith, and extended life with the written word. I walked on the edge of a blade, yet I left behind a road that others could travel. I am dead. But whenever you walk into a library and turn the page of a book, whenever you look up at a cathedral dome and hear the tolling of a bell, whenever you see the word empire in a history book, in all of that, there is a shadow of me. You call me Charlemagne. May my story, like the night snow, fall silently upon the surface of time, leaving behind a thin, pale layer of light.